I promise I'm back. Good evening once again. Welcome to today's video where we are looking at what we call the part 2 of what we call the blood circulation. If you find this video helpful, please make sure you like the video, comment down in the comment section, and please subscribe. In the previous video, we looked at what we call the different types of blood circulations. We looked at what we call the pulmonary circulation, the systemic circulation, and even what we call the coronary circulation. We went ahead and looked at what we call the step-by-step in what we call the pulmonary circulation. In this video, we are going to be mainly focusing on what we call the principles of circulatory function, and finally, we shall talk about the functions of what we call the pulmonary circulation. Let's go ahead and get started. We are starting with what we call the principles of what we call a circulatory function. Now, the first principle of among the principles of circulatory function is that the blood flow is auto-regulated. What do I mean by this? Is that, for example, if you start to do a vigorous exercise, the tissue demands will not remain the same. Okay, the tissue demands are going to be increasing. For that reason, even the blood flow to those tissues are going to be increasing. They are increasing automatically. That's why we are saying that the blood flow to the tissues depends on what we call the demand. For that reason, blood flow to the tissues is going to be auto-regulated depending on what we call the tissue demands. Okay. And then when we say that the cardiac output is the sum of all the tissue flow. So now all the blood which comes out of the heart, it goes to the entire body tissues, utilizes them. That kind of the blood, eventually at the end of it all, under normal circumstances, that blood has to come back to the heart. Okay, that is what we mean by saying that the cardiac output is the sum of all the tissue flows. All that blood which is in the tissues is from what we call the cardiac output. And of course, the cardiac output is the volume of blood pumped out of the heart in just 1 minute. Okay. Then also have what we call the arterial pressure. Arterial pressure regulation is independent of the cardiac output. Now, what do I mean by this? We are trying to mean is that arterial pressure, this is the pressure which drives all the blood to the tissues depending on what we call the need. Now, let's first pretend for a minute that there's a slight decrease in what we call the pressure. Maybe you have just abruptly, when you stand up, there's that kind of the brief fall in what we call the blood pressure. Now, what happens is that the heart is designed with a specific kind of the mechanisms that will maintain, that will regulate what we call the arterial pressure independent of what we call the cardiac output. What happens is that when there's that kind of the slight decrease in blood pressure, we have what we call the baroreceptors, which are going to be residing on what we call the aortic arch, and even also what we call the carotid tissues. What happens is that when this kind of the structures senses a decrease in blood pressure, they will send a signal to the central nervous system, of which the central nervous system will respond by making by a physiological mechanism which increases what we call the heart rate. And of course, when you increase the heart rate, you are increasing what we call the cardiac output. Once you increase the cardiac output, you are increasing what we call the blood pressure. So now, by doing all that, the arterial pressure regulation is going to be independent of what we call the cardiac output. Okay, it is such another beautiful thing. So now, the third principle is that the blood pressure gradients determines the blood flow. So now this is self-explanatory. Is that blood moves from the areas of high pressures to the areas of low pressures. That is it. Okay. When we say that a pressure gradient determines the blood flow, blood always likes to move to the areas which are having low pressures. Okay. And then when we talk about that, valves ensures unidirectional of blood flow. We said that one of the minor kind of the component of the cardiovascular system, we said we have what we call the valves. The valves are going to be residing in what we call the heart, and even also in what we call the veins. They are the structures which ensures unidirectional in blood flow. Okay, so now in cardiovascular system, we need the blood to flow in one direction, and who is helping that? What we call the valves. Okay. And then we also have what we call the blood capillaries are the primary exchange sites. This one is self-explanatory, okay? And the reason why the blood capillaries are the exchange sites of most areas is that they are thin-walled vessels, which enables a diffusion of in and out of different substances, okay? For example, the exchange of the gases is going to be happening on what we call the pulmonary capillaries. Okay. Besides that, even all other kind of the capillaries are going to be helping in exchange of different substances, nutrients, oxygen, and then even also in return of what we call the different wastes. All that one makes a lot of sense. And then the last one is that blood circulation is a closed system. Now this is self-explanatory. Now cardiovascular system works under what we call a closed circulation. Blood should move inside the blood vessel. There is not at any point that we want this blood to move out of the blood vessels. What happens that when blood moves out of the blood vessels, that is what we call bleeding, okay? And that's not a normal physiological process. A normal physiological process is that blood has to move from what we call the heart. From the heart, it has to go to what we call to the tissues, and eventually from the tissues, it has to come back to the heart. Okay, minus moving out. The nutrients are going to be the one which are going to be moving out of that blood or the blood vessels, not the blood itself. Okay, so now how is the blood going to be moving in blood vessels? Let's say, for example, the blood is going to be moving from what we call the left ventricle into this kind of rich, largest kind of the artery. Okay, so now this kind of largest artery, which we are calling the aorta, it will move into small kind of the arteries. From the small arteries, this blood will move into what we call the arterioles. From the arteriole, this blood will now go into what we call the blood capillaries for exchange of different substances. From there, we shall have what we call the post capillary vessels, which we are calling the venules. From there, the venules will come together, multiple of them, to make what we call the big kind of this vein. You see this big kind of the veins, what we call the inferior vena cava. It drains all that blood back to the heart, especially what we call the right side of the heart. Okay, all that one makes a lot of sense. So now, blood circulation is going to be a closed system. Okay, so now that briefly covers what we call the principles of what we call circulatory function. Now let's go ahead and look at what we call the functions played by what we call the pulmonary circulations. Okay, so now before we go into the functions of what we call the pulmonary circulation, let's just first have a brief recap of what we just said in the previous video. We said that the pulmonary circulation is going to be starting from what we call the right ventricle. The right ventricle is going to be squeezing this blood as if it has never squeezed before to hit this kind of the structure calling the pulmonary semilunar valve. Once the blood bypasses the pulmonary semilunar valve, it will enter what we call the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk will bifurcate into what we call the right pulmonary artery and then the left pulmonary artery. Now, the left pulmonary artery will take this blood to the left lung, and then the right pulmonary artery will take it to the right lung. We said that eventually this kind of the left pulmonary artery is going to be now dividing into some other kind of the tiny kind of the vessels, which we are calling the pulmonary arterioles. Then from the pulmonary arterioles, they are going to also be splitting further into what we call the pulmonary capillaries. And of course, the pulmonary capillaries are going to be the ones which are going to be responsible for the exchange of what we call the gases, okay? At the entry of what we call oxygen and exit of what we call the carbon dioxide. And then we said that you're going to be having what we call the post-pulmonary capillary vessels, where we are going to be having what we call the pulmonary venules as number 7. Now, multiple of the pulmonary venules will come together and make what we call the pulmonary vein. And eventually, the pulmonary veins are the ones which are going to be now pulling the oxygen-rich blood back into what we call the left atrium. The left atrium will push this blood to knock for this kind of the valve we are calling the mitral valve, or what we call the bicuspid valve, to enter into what we call the left ventricle. And we said the left ventricle was the end point of what we call pulmonary circulation. Once the blood leaves the left ventricle and it enters into the aorta, that now becomes another kind of the circuit which we are calling the systemic circulation. So now that was a brief overview in what we call the pulmonary circulation. So now you have seen how the blood is moving from the heart to the lungs and then back to the left side of the heart. So now what is the significance of this pulmonary circulation? The first function of the pulmonary circulation is going to be gas exchange. Okay, the first function is going to be what we call gas. It's going to be what we call gas exchange. Okay, we have seen gas exchange was happening in what we call the alveolus. You see, this is going to be now our alveolus. It is one which is going to be having rich in oxygen and then poor in carbon dioxide. For that reason, we are going to be having high partial pressure of carbon dioxide in these pulmonary capillaries and then less of the partial pressure of oxygen. And because of the partial pressure gradient, oxygen will be forced to enter the pulmonary capillaries as carbon dioxide exits into what we call the alveolus and then is pooped out during ventilation. Okay, so now the first function of pulmonary circulation is got what we call gas exchange. Now, The second one is what we call blood pH regulation. The second function is what we call blood pH regulation. Okay, what do I mean by this? Whenever the blood is having too much accumulation of what we call the carbon dioxide, it will make this blood to become super acidic because too much of the carbon dioxide will react with water to form what we call the carbonic acid, of which the carbonic acid will eventually break into what we call the protons and what we call the bicarbonate. So if you have accumulated what we call the protons, you are making the blood super acidic. But what happens is that as this blood is having a lot of the carbon dioxide, when it reaches into what we call the lungs, you're going to be having what we call the exchange of that carbon dioxide. It goes out in exchange of what we call oxygen. By doing that, we are regulating the amount of the carbon dioxide in our blood. By doing that, we are maintaining what we call the blood pH. It also makes a lot of sense. Okay. Another function of the what we call the pulmonary circulation is that this kind of the pulmonary circulation also serves as what we call blood reservoir. What do I mean by this? Now, on entire total cardiac output, there's going to be an extensive amount of the blood which goes into the pulmonary circulation and gets reserved in what we call the pulmonary circuit. Because of that, whenever there is that kind of an increased demand somewhere, maybe following an extensive loss during the bleeding, this kind of the pulmonary circuit can allow some of the blood to come back into the general circulation to help in the normal running of what you call the cells. By doing that, the pulmonary circulation is also serving as a blood reserve. Okay. And then the fourth function of what we call the pulmonary circulation is that we have what we call pulmonary circulation also serves as a filtering role. It plays also a filtering. It plays what we call a filtration role. Now, what do I mean by say pulmonary circulation plays a filtration role? The body always forms what we call multiple of tiny kind of what we call clots. What happens is that when these clots moves into what we call the pulmonary circuit, especially towards what we call the pulmonary arterioles, there are a lot of enzymatic reactions and even also what we call fibrinolytics that are always produced to make sure that these kind of the tiny clots are continuously broken down, are continuously filtered out, such that they don't enter into what we call the general circulation, which will cause a lot of the troubles. By doing that, by the pulmonary circuit filtering all that kind of the clots, we are ensuring that there is going to be a continuous blood flow into what we call the pulmonary veins and then back to the heart. Now, if the kind of the clot becomes extensively too big to an extent that it cannot be broken down during the pulmonary circuit, it means it is going to be causing what we call pulmonary embolism. And of course, if it causes the pulmonary embolism, that area where it has occluded, that kind of the post area will not be getting what we call the circulations. It will lead to what we call the pulmonary infections. And of course, besides that pulmonary infection, the blood which is going to be coming this side will be facing a lot of the resistance on that area which is occluded by the clot. In the result, shall have an increase in the pressures within the pulmonary circuit, which we call the pulmonary hypertension. What happens is that the heart has now that backup pressure of making sure that the right ventricle pushes with enough force to overcome this kind of the resistance. And in the long run, we shall have now that our right ventricle is going to become a bit swollen, okay, which we call the right-sided cardiomegaly, because of that kind of the repeated strongest contraction to overcome what we call the resistance, which is as a result of what we call the pulmonary embolism. Okay, we shall come back into the detail of that during the study of what we call the pulmonary embolism. Okay. So now that's what we call plays a filtration role. And then the last kind of the function of the pulmonary circuit is that it has what we call metabolic role. Okay. So now the pulmonary circuit also plays what we call the metabolic role. What do I mean by this? That within what we call the pulmonary capillaries, the endothelial lining of the pulmonary capillaries, we have a super very important kind of the enzyme, and that enzyme is super very important in what we call renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system activation. What happens is that in the pulmonary capillaries endothelial cells, we have a specific type of the enzyme which we call angiotensin converting enzyme. How does this one happen exactly? The liver produces a protein molecule called angiotensinogen. Now, this angiotensinogen, under the influence of renin coming from the joxer cells in the kidneys, this kind of angiotensinogen is going to get converted into angiotensin 1. Now, what happens is that angiotensin 1, as is passing through what we call the pulmonary capillaries, we are going to be seeing now our enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme converting angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Now, angiotensin 2 has a lot of different effects. For example, vasoconstriction, stimulating the adrenal gland to release a lot of the aldosterone. So now, by doing that, this system is aiming at regulating the blood pressure whenever there's such kind of the drop in the blood pressure. Okay, so now that's what we mean by we're saying that also the pulmonary circulation, by the influence of the angiotensin converting enzyme coming from the pulmonary capillaries, serves as what we call the metabolic role. Okay. So now that briefly covers the functions of what we call the pulmonary circulation. So now Tumnad, in this video, we have covered the basic principles of what we call circulatory function, and we have also covered what we call the functions of the pulmonary circulation. Now, in the next video, we are going to start off on what we call the systemic circulation. So now if you think whatever I've talked is making sense, is adding to you, you have enjoyed, you know what to do. You hit like button, comment down in the comment section, and please subscribe to Tumnad as always. Until we meet next time.